Thank you so much for that introduction, and it's great to have this panel to kick off this event, and of course congratulations to Rekha and her team for bringing this event to fruition. It's a much needed contribution to the debate about where we are in the transatlantic alliance, and it's very fitting that it's in Budapest, which is the place where we really need to keep the transatlantic dialogue going, and congratulations to Rekha and all your team for making this happen. This is the most gender imbalanced panel I've chaired for a long time. Sebastian Gorka said he was old school, so it does feel like the good old days here doing this. But I'll crack on because I understand that one or two members of our panel need to leave early for other duties. This is a time of flux, and we've seen this flux is driven by three critical developments. One, of course, is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has framed the geostrategic debate for the last 3 years or even more. But we've had a wave of elections. We've had, of course, the most critical election that we had was in the United States. But we've also seen over the last days and weeks, in fact, elections in Germany. We had the first round of presidential elections yesterday in Poland. We had the second round of elections for the presidency of Romania yesterday as well. We had an election in Portugal. So the political landscape in Europe is shifting as well. So amongst all of these developments, there are two critical areas where we're seeing things shifting. One is in the policy debate. And it's a policy debate about the relationship between the United States and Europe. It's a policy debate about the response of Europe to the invasion of Ukraine. But there's also a policy debate within Europe, and we're seeing shifting developments also as a function of Brexit. And we've seen recently, and it was mentioned by some of the previous speakers, the ongoing dialogue between the United Kingdom and the European Union on a new defence and security treaty. So there's all sorts of things happening there. But it's not a question of just policy where this debate is happening. It's an area where we're talking about capabilities, specifically the military response to the Russian invasion, also the defence technologies that have to be developed, and also the level of defence spending and commitment, political commitment within our polities to fund those new capability requirements. So a huge amount on the table, and we've got a very limited amount of time with our panel to discuss about this. So I'd like to kick off straight away with Matthew Boyse from the Hudson Institute. And I know Sebastian already answered the question, or at least in his terms he answered it. But there is this fundamental question, isn't there, Matt, about the relationship between the US and Europe. And I'm sure every conference you go to, you also get asked the same question. How reliable is the US? What's your take on this critical question? Can you reassure the audience, or what's your take on that angle?
Thank you. So thank you, Mark. So this is Sebastian Gorka put it in very colorful and direct terms. So it's hard to follow that. But there are maybe a few things that he didn't say in the short period he was speaking. And this whole question of dependability is sort of, people before the election used to come into Hudson Institute on a regular basis and ask us, well, so what can we expect if Trump wins the election? Can we rely on the United States? Is the United States a dependable ally? And of course, my reaction was, well, of course. I can't believe you're asking the question. And because, we've been with Europe for 75 years. We've accompanied Europe through thick and thin. We've enabled the collapse of the Soviet Empire and the entry into NATO of all the countries in the Warsaw Pact. And so you have this sort of like, well, why are you even asking this question? And of course, this is very common in certain parts of the commentariat, and of course, I sort of wondered, why is this? is it, what is it, what, I don't want, it's hard to you don't want to become a psychoanalyst here, but sort of it raises this question, like, what lies at the root of this? Is it, and you can only, I think in the end I kind of came to the conclusion that it had to do something more with sort of a deep sense of perhaps sort of a self-centeredness that was kind of unaware of some of the things that were going on in the United States, which was causing people in the president's kind of in the MAGA movement or in people who are supporting the president to ask questions of Europeans and our other allies to the extent that they would actually support us. And so the point is that they were sort of trying to answer this question, and I think it became a question of self-centeredness and of self kind of justification. In other words, you Americans are asking us to do things that, and so can we really rely on you? And so it was sort of difficult to understand, but it was a very simplistic idea, and I thought I think it's just not very helpful at all for us to be having this conversation about dependability or not, because we are dependable, and we will be dependable, and of course Sebastian mentioned sort of some of the conditions, but we will be dependable, and of course I was sort of kind of bit my lip and say, well, we could turn the question around. I mean, can we depend on you? Because, will you be there for us if something were to happen as well? You were after 9/11, and that was all, that was deeply, deeply appreciated in the United States. And highly, highly respected. But that's that was then, and we face some other challenges right now. Sort of going forward. And so but I think the whole question we shouldn't really be going into this space at all, because I think we are there for each other, and we don't need to get bogged down in this question, because it just doesn't really help. And we're there for you as you're there for us. And that's the way it should be, and we shouldn't really get distracted by this conversation. It's not very helpful. And of course, then there's the question of then sometimes you even get into this question of defense. It's sort of can we even be sure that that you'll continue to supply F-16 parts or F-35 parts or something? This is a distraction. It's a red herring. It's not. It's not going to happen.
Well, thank you, Ben. And I will actually come around in the second round of questions to talking a little bit more about defense technologies, defense industries, and how that's going to be moving in the future as well. But I'd like to also turn now to Jörn Fleck, and thank you, Jörn, for stepping in at short notice for this panel in your role as Senior Director for the Europe Centre at the Atlantic Council. I'd like you perhaps to take this opportunity, since you are Washington-based, is to drill down a little bit into what's going on in Washington, because the US policy towards Europe is not only driven by what's going on in the White House, but it's also driven by what's going on in Congress, against the background of what is happening on the ground in Ukraine. And we're seeing actually a new development now, where Congress is now stepping up into the debate as well about engagement. We're seeing the Lindsey Graham-sponsored bill on Russia sanctions, which is emerging. How do you see this interplay behind the scenes in Washington driving US policy? And do you see Congress perhaps taking a much more activist role in this debate if the situation in Ukraine doesn't come to some sort of peaceful conclusion shortly, whether through the way the negotiations are going or not going, what's happening on the ground? How do you see that playing out over the next few months in the Beltway in Washington?
Well, thank you for that question. And first of all, Reka, Tamas, thank you so much for having me, and congratulations to you and your teams for a great event, an amazing program. 2 is a series, and next year you will have established a tradition. So congratulations. To your question, maybe briefly on some points that Matt raised. I think Europeans can be forgiven for questioning U.S. commitment to Europe's security and defense. If you look at the first, where are we now? 120 days, 115 or so of the Trump administration's second term. Between the Oval Office meeting with President Zelensky, the temporary intel and military assistance freeze for support for Ukraine, Liberation Day, tariffs on America's closest ally at 20%. I think you can forgive Europeans for asking themselves the question of U.S. commitment to Europe's security and defense, to NATO, and I think it would be irresponsible of European decision makers not to think through the worst case scenarios of having to defend Europe without U.S. support. That's the responsibility of every European decision maker. That said, I think questions about why do you not love us anymore and will you abandon us are not helpful at all either, right? We need to, I think Europeans ought to focus very clearly on what they can control, and that is what they bring to Europe's security and defense, what they do about their own capabilities, what they do about their defense spending, and what they bring into NATO, what they bring to the table in The Hague, what they should have brought to the table many NATO summits ago. That's what Europe can control. Europe cannot control what this administration does. It can try and influence that, can try and incentivize the administration to stay committed, but ultimately can only control what it brings to the table on European security and defense. And that ought to be the focus for all Europeans, in my opinion. To your question, look, I think waiting for the United States Congress to save Europe is another symptom of this fundamental misunderstanding of trying to figure out ways of avoiding the worst in Washington, D.C. I don't think, even though there are changes, you referred to Lindsey Graham's efforts to influence the administration. There are other senators and members of Congress that are obviously trying to speak to the president. Ultimately, I think we're dealing with an administration with a decision maker of one. And I don't think some sort of firewall or the grants of former Republican foreign policy is that the Republican foreign policy establishment in Congress will come and save Europe, come and save Ukraine. Europeans will have to do that by themselves.
Thank you. Well, actually, that final comment is a fantastic segue to the question I was going to ask Tomi, because you said a very important thing, that in the United States there is a decision maker of one. And Tomi, obviously you're an old hand in Brussels. You're the executive director of the Wilfried Martens Center for European Studies. We have multiple decision makers in Europe. We don't have a decision maker of one. And in fact, over the last few months, we've seen a sort of a smorgasbord, if you like, of decision makers coming forward. I mean, we have the European Council on the one hand, but recently, as particularly over the last few weeks, we've seen the emergence of what some people call a new directorate of Europe emerging, which is not of the 27 of all the member states of the European Union and the European Council, but you have a sort of a new group of leaders. So it's obviously Friedrich Merz, you have Mr. Macron, President Macron, you have Donald Tusk from Poland, and interesting, you have Keir Starmer, so Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, coming into Kiev, and you have a new axis, as it were, of decision makers driving Europe. Some irritation on the part of Giorgia Meloni that she is not included included. And as I said, you have Sir Keir Starmer, obviously after Brexit, Britain's not a member of the EU, but nonetheless he was there with the EU leaders. And as we've heard in one or two other comments, there is currently a new defence and security treaty which is being negotiated between the European Union and the UK, which will hopefully bring in London back into the sort of the defence dialogue within Europe. So how do you see this evolving? We're seeing, so who actually, number one, who is in charge of what Europe, how Europe is responding to its relationship with the United States, and how do you see this evolving in the future?
Thank you, Marek, and thanks first of all, Reka and Tamas. Nice to see you this morning, and lovely to see you all here. Indeed, as said already many times, this in Martens Center considered it's very important platform, and we were very enthusiastic when you launched that. Marek, to your question, I think in many bad news what we had in last 2-3 years, I think that one good news is that now we are living in a moment that you seem to have a team of European leaders who are managed to communicate and have more or less and coordinate the position. Especially as it comes to communication with the United States, as it comes on issues related to Ukraine. I think the UK involvement is very good news. I think with this whole war in Ukraine, the other bad things, included the silver lining, is indeed that we managed to go beyond the Brexit debate, and now we have found the common European defence is the common platform on which we can work on. But I think to your question, who is calling the shots? And I go back to the title of this conference, the slogan, break up or wake up. I think there's a kind of one misperception on this whole development. That many times when we speak about European common defense, the first question we make, what is happening in decision making European level, and Andreas Kubilius is a big part of that. But and the common level is important, and the Commission is very EU's role and Commission's role is very important. But as we know, EU doesn't have much of the mandate, and it has new tasks which has not been there before, and it's giving added value. But the make or break happens in member states. Because all these concepts, all these constructions, and attempts to trying to make common defense market, hybrid warfare, military mobility, that's important. But the key issue are the capabilities in the member states. Is the investment there? If you are just a couple of, one concrete example. Already in this discussion yesterday, we had arguments yesterday that when we had our dinner that that we are so much behind on defense. But if you would just take maybe you heard that Finland last week declared that it's going to upgrade its mobilization age to 65. That means that it has a reserve of 1 million men. So that's close to 20% of the population. On the other hand, for example, in Poland, they are now in 4.5 and etc. So if only countries, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Baltic states, Poland, Germany, Poland and Romania, not excluding even Germany or excluding Ukraine, would go do 4.5 in budget, and B, have a same drafting model than Finland. In volume basis, we would be already matching Russia. Of course, it's not that simple, but just to show that it's really question of the question of member states. So to conclude, I think that's the really. So you have multi levels. You have this new team which is communicating with US, trying to have a common position in Ukraine, etc. Then you have the Commission with the new mandates, but they are working on the member states are very clearly leading this process. But the real challenge will be what the political discussions on each individual country, because everybody are in favor of more defense, but everybody are also against on cutting education, healthcare, pensions, because that's what it entails at the end of the day.
Well, thank you, Tomi. And amongst all these new, as it were, networks of leadership that we're talking about, there's a common element, and one of those common elements is Germany. And Nico Lange is the you are the Zeitenwende-Initiative senior fellow, and that was the buzzword that we heard 2 years ago from the former Chancellor Scholz. So the question really to you, Nico, is how is Zeitenwende working out? Can you give us a little bit of insight from your position about what is happening in Berlin, especially after the elections to the Bundestag and the change in government in Germany? Where is Zeitenwende now? And is it now being taken more seriously than it was under the Scholz administration? And will Germany finally do what Radek Sikorski wanted Germany to do in his famous speech in Germany a few years ago? He said that the only one worse thing than activity of Germany is lack of activity of Germany. Is Germany now finally able to stand up to its responsibilities and take a full partnership role in this response that is necessary to the strategic threats that Europe is taking? How do you see it moving?
Well, thank you for the invitation and the question. Let me start answering this by quickly referring to Europe, because this is a term that we are all using. And being a good German, I want to clarify the terms first. Germany is not Europe. Even the European Union is not Europe. I think that's a common misconception. And if we talk about defense, I think Boris Ruge said it earlier, if we are talking about collective defense, then we are talking about NATO Europe. And there is, I think, much to be said for NATO Europe stepping up. But where does Europe start? Does it start at the Hungarian-Ukrainian border, somewhere west of Ukraine? My point is, Ukraine is Europe. And if we talk about European security, we have to decide that the security of Ukraine and the security of Europe, it's the same question. It's not different questions. And unfortunately, Germany, my country, so far has not clarified this. We are always saying, oh, we're supporting Ukraine, and then we are building up the security of Europe. Are those different things? I think that's a big problem. I think other countries, such as Denmark, for example, they have long decided it's the same question. And we have to make this strategic decision. I hope the new government does that. On European defense, to be very honest with you, I hear also at this event what is said by representatives from the United States of America. My advice to European decision makers, including the German Chancellor, is as interesting as entertaining Trump TV is, let's not be busy by just watching Trump TV all of the time. Let's focus on our own agenda. Because there will be no relief by, we go all to Kiev and then we produce a picture of how we Europeans are strong by calling President Trump, and our best hope is that at some point Trump might get angry at Putin. I think that's not enough for European security. Let's focus on investing into the Ukrainian defense sector. Let's focus on delivering military capabilities to Ukraine. Let's focus on getting European defense production ramped up, especially in quantities. Let's find a technological base in Europe and finance it so that we don't only have to buy in the United States of America, that we can produce stuff and have an independence from the unpredictability of the Trump administration when it comes to security in Europe. I think that's all things we could do. I see some steps to answer your question, I see some steps into that direction. Germany, under the leadership already of the elected Chancellor Merz, changing its constitution, giving Germany the financial possibilities to contribute more to European defense. And we just recently had a German Minister of Foreign Affairs saying that 3.5% of defense spending plus 1.5% for defense-relevant infrastructures is the right goal. And I think that is not without a debate in Germany, but I think the direction of travel is clear. It's much better to focus on what Germany can do, I agree with what has been said, than to hope for twists and turns in the relationship the Europeans are having with the Trump administration. I hope that Germany will, that's my last point, I hope that Germany will get the courage to take defense decisions in Germany, even if large parts or significant parts of the German public and the German political spectrum will be against it. Germany has a history in doing that, from rearmament to double-track decision to German reunification. But I think we will see a Germany, if it gets more robust on defense, that will also get more domestic protests, more hard conflicts around the security question. And that is, where it takes representative leadership by Friedrich Merz to overcome the struggle. I cannot but notice, as a last side remark, because J.D. Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference was mentioned, that most of those who are perceived by parts of the US government as potential partners or as aligned with the agenda are opposing significant steps towards European defense in our policy discussion, and I think it's necessary to point that out.
Well, we've moved in this panel from very sort of general discussions about US policy towards Europe to some very specific issues, particularly in Germany, on defense spending and spending on defense capabilities. So I'd like to, in the second round of questions before I open it up to Q&A, to go around the panel again and have a little bit of a deeper dive into this whole issue of defense capability, resilience, and the Europe-US relationship in that regard. Matt, you know, I'd like to sort of kick off with you and talk about a little bit more about the US perspective on defense capabilities. For a very long time, we've seen that US defense industry, defense sales were a key instrument of US policy, but there have been difficulties in that. I mean, we've seen, particularly you're seeing right now as Europe needs to rearm very, very quickly, it's looking to other vendors, it's looking to Korea, it's looking to its own industries, and part of the reason is because of the US policy on defense exports makes it really quite difficult to rapidly export defense equipment. There are issues with the FMS process, and we know that President Trump has taken some action to smooth that over, but also issues of technology transfer. And I think this is one of the areas where there are barriers. What can be done to, as Europe needs to increase its resilience, needs to increase defense spending, needs to procure, how can the US still keep engaged in Europe in that regard when the process right now makes it really difficult for US defense industry to be active in Europe and competing and really assisting in that resilience building?
Well, that starts getting very technical, and I'm not it's sort of an armaments guy, but they're definitely these are definitely issues, and in addition to, of course, the larger issue of can't even defense suppliers keep up with the demand. Because you know how long it takes to build some of these pieces of equipment and how complicated they are, and so this is not exactly so you have all these you have these barriers which need to be addressed, but then you also have other aspects which are causing some disquiet in the United States, and that has to do with some of the proposals that are making their way through the European Parliament or through the Commission, that have to do with sort of with all this new money that the Commission has set aside for defense, which is all fantastic, assuming it goes to buy hard capabilities, because we've always been talking about the question of 2% or 3.5 or 5 or whatever, and so the percent is actually indicative, but it's not decisive. What's decisive is the capabilities and how much and what that is being spent for. But that's a side point. Some of the proposals that are making their way through the European bureaucracy as to how to spend all this money, which is very, very welcomed. Some of those proposals are also causing some concern in the United States among people who sort of say, well, wait a second, is this going to be EU only, or is this going to include other partners? Because this has always been it's been more of a market until now. And of course, this may introduce all sorts of restrictive measures, as it were, that will exclude various major players. And so so the question is, can you produce world-class kit with only EU producers. You can produce pretty good stuff. But do you want to exclude some of the other major players because the international kind of armaments market is or business or whatever is actually it's all international. Rarely do you have one country that produces anything by itself. It's all cooperative. And so do you want to exclude the Norwegians, or do you want to exclude the Canadians, or do you want to exclude the UK, or do you want to exclude the Turks, or do you want to exclude the United States, all of which have actually rather significant defense industries and produce very, very good stuff. So the question is just to what extent is this, kind of, restrictive and focused on key, a few key countries, or is it going to be a bit more, it's the way it's always been, which is very international and very collaborative and sort of consortia of multiple countries all working together to produce the best possible stuff. So maybe I'll just stop there. But these are things that are sort of as we look at the legislation going through the European Parliament and all the various proposals and how all this stuff is going to happen. These are also factors as well, in addition to the things that you rightfully mentioned, and that is the sort of what the United States needs to do to ease the process.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to take you up, Matt. Before I come back to you, Jörn, I just want to sort of maybe skip a beat and go to Tomi and then come back to you, because Tomi, what Matt has raised is really very important. It's the impact of the current European Union initiatives to rearm quickly, and there is the rearm program. And there's a debate right now within the European Commission and also within the European Parliament about how that funding needs to be structured. And there are two really very significant problems. One is, how do you structure that in a way which doesn't push US industry out of Europe? In other words, how do you keep the United States defense industry engaged in some of these spending opportunities? But also at a domestic level, there's also a bit of a debate on whether or not there's a temptation to draw up a new dividing line in European defense resilience and defense industry, where some of the main beneficiaries of this funding could end up being France and Germany in particular. And there's a battle to what extent these Central European defense industries can also participate in this. So this very good idea of rearmament spending brings with it some challenges, both to the US-European relationship and also within Europe as well. It could be a program that causes as much division as it creates unity. What's your response to Matt's concerns?
Yeah, indeed. Thanks, Matthew. Yeah. In short, it's complicated. Exactly as you say, there's a paradox or dilemma. On the other hand, in order to develop our European defense industry, we need cooperation with the United States. Evidently, that's a parameter. But in the second hand, if we need certain amount of independence and purchase demand from Europe in order to have our and in the long-term perspective, in order to have, enough, so the defense industry can make the calculation investment and start to build on that. And of course within there you have a more, maybe France, who are, have more historically different approach than maybe the others. But the one dimension, we have been a little bit. Maybe siding, and we hear it in this room. We did hear very well appreciated comments to NATO. But let's not forget that the discussion, let's say 2 months ago, was quite different. In a moment when the whole issue of the Greenland came on table, various decisions were made, for example, related to F-35s. And there's a kill switch discussion. So luckily it seems that the dust has been a little bit settling down. But I think there is this, question. Let's put it this way: if you look at polling citizens and ask them, do you assume that if there would be larger conflict, the United States would come to help? For example, in Finland, in my country, which is a NATO member, who relies a lot of, U.S. relations, has many deals, and is committed, 70% of the population thinks that U.S. will not come. And of course, this then have this related to the whole Denmark-Finland discussions. There's a question, do we need to be self-reliant? And so also what I want to point out that this trust dimension, and this event is one of those platforms which this trust and communication can be rebuilt, is very important as it comes to the US participation.
Thank you. Well, Jörn, I want to go back a little bit to what Sebastian Gorka was talking about, was about this pivot to recognizing China as the main civilizational threat. Is that really a common perspective in Washington? After all, the last 60 years, the last 80 years, in fact, of the focus of U.S. foreign policy in terms of geopolitical security has been structured around Europe, from the days of the Cold War with the Soviet Union and so on. How easy is it to move that ship of opinion, if you like? I mean, like an oil tanker. For decades we were focused so much on this threat from the Soviet Union, and obviously we're aware of what's going on in Ukraine right now. So is this shift towards China really that deep in terms of how expert opinion is moving in Washington, or is this something that's still, in other words, how deep is still the sense in Washington that actually there really is also a primary threat here in Europe that the United States should continue to be involved in very deeply? What's your view on that?
So on that, I think it's been called the last bipartisan issue, right, in Washington, D.C., that everyone is hawkish on China. I still think there's a debate about, I think many people will be familiar with that debate about the sort of Asia firsters, those that believe the United States has to focus on that one formidable challenge from China that overwrites everything else, that the United States cannot do two theaters, so to speak, and treating Europe and the Indo-Pacific as distinct theaters. And then those that would say, even on the Republican side, that the United States can and must do both, even if perhaps resources have to be slightly reallocated to the Indo-Pacific, and that Europe has to step up, but that the United States has a critical interest in European security as well. I think if this administration cares so much about China as this overriding strategic challenge and adversary, then when you have North Korean soldiers fighting in Ukraine on Russia's side, when you have now Chinese mercenaries, according to some reports, fighting there, when Russia could not continue its war without Chinese semiconductors and other support, critical support, then this administration should care about very much, deeply, about where Russia's brutal, unjustified war in Ukraine goes, and that Putin cannot be allowed to dictate some sort of settlement that does not secure Ukraine's sovereignty, self-determination, its freedom. And everything to cut corners around that will actually be watched extremely closely by Beijing for its own purposes, very obviously vis-a-vis its posture and potential aggression against Taiwan. And I think that is so obvious, and that's a question that this administration hasn't really answered very well, or in any shape or form, in my opinion. I want to come back to, very briefly, to something that Nico and Matt raised on the European defense front. I think it's very clear that we have a strong convergence around Europeans recognizing Russia as an existential threat and knowing they have to do more for their own defense, and that Europe has to rearm. To Nico's point, we don't really have clarity on how to organize Europe's rearmament. Between NATO, its defense planning, capability target setting, regional plans and so on, established mechanisms and procedures, and political commitments, between the European Union driving market integration, setting some incentives, and here, frankly, I think from US industry, it's sort of the story of the world's smallest violin, you know, that 150 billion euros that the Commission proposes to set out and limits to EU, EFTA, and countries with defense agreements with the European Union is the end of American defense sectoral access to European defense projects. I mean, it's laughable, frankly. And then, so NATO, EU, and then you have the national level and sort of small coalitions of the willing. And if we want the efficiencies out of this and avoid some of the domestic debates around, is it, you know, guns or butter type juxtaposition, then we're gonna have to figure out how each of those levels does more together in a more coordinated way. And I don't think that is impossible to figure out.
Well, I'm conscious of time, and we do need time for Q&A, but I'd like to round off this panel by asking Nico, probably with a fundamental question, actually, because we've been talking in this section a little bit more about resilience, primarily at the military level and defense industry level. Resilience is not just military, it's also economic, it's also to do with public opinion. And during the Istanbul negotiations, the Russian delegation, or there was a comment saying, we can do this for another 20 years from Russia, saying we can continue to fight and fight and fight. How long can you fight? And this is really the crucial question, Nico, I think, both at the European level and also at the level of public opinion in member states. How long do we have? What is the threshold that public opinion can continue to support the level of, not just the level of physical fighting, but also the privations that will come, of the very difficult policy choices that will come in certain European polities as defense spending gets ramped up? Obviously, welfare is going to have to get cut. There are going to be choices, difficult choices to be made by political leaders in Europe. How resilient are our democracies in continuing this struggle when faced with an autocratic assault where there is no such domestic pressure? To what extent can we hold out as long as we can?
Long question. First of all, regardless of what Putin's representative said in Istanbul, Russia cannot fight this forever. And let's not believe in this kind of mythology that nobody is able to beat Russia and all of that. I mean, nobody wants to march on Moscow anyway, so let's not fall into that trap. And if we would have put our resources together faster and not had this kind of reluctant debates of whether an infantry fighting vehicle delivered to Ukraine will trigger nuclear Armageddon, then the situation in Ukraine would be militarily much better now. So let's not, I mean, and it's one of the problems of the German and the European debate is that we are having the same debates over and over and over. When do we want to move on? Russia is beatable. The amount of military capabilities you need to give to Ukraine, to put Russia under pressure in Ukraine, it's not rocket science, it's doable. Let's do it. The faster we do it, the less the problem you mentioned with the resilience and all of that, the less the problem matters. The more we drag this out, the more room we give to the Kremlin voices that we have in our political spectrum who are echoing the Russian foreign and security policy. So faster and decisive action, it doesn't seem to be a modus for the European institutions and for some European governments, but that could end this very quickly and put pressure on Russia. And on the economic part and the defense industry part, I find it ridiculous that we always talk, oh, Russia is on a war footing and there is a war industry in Russia and we all have to be afraid of that. The NATO Europeans have economies that are together 20 times the size of the economy of Russia. Really, what are we afraid of? We can outproduce Russia if we want to, easily. We can send a message to the other side, whatever you will do, we will produce more, we will produce it faster. There's no way you can't win. The problem is that we are giving Putin hope that he can win by being so reluctant and so slow, and by having this discussion, oh, will Germany break apart because we spend a few more of percentage on GDP? No, Germany won't break. But you cannot have this discussion until the last person is convinced. You have to find a majority and make a decision. I think that we have a decision-making problem in our Western democracies. One point on industry. Before the Munich Security Conference, the consensus, I think, in NATO Europe was, yes, we will spend more on defense, and we will spend large parts on it buying American. After J.D. Vance's speech at Munich Security Conference, this turned into a consensus, yes, we will spend more on defense, but we will do everything we can to spend as little as necessary to the United States of America, and to do more industrially and technologically in Europe. And I see also in Germany, if you talk about public debate, I see no acceptance if now we have large debts because of defense spending, that the first big spending will be a spending buying something in the United States, like it was with the first 100 billion of special funds where the F-35 decision was taken. No, it has to be European, and we will see conversion of automotive industry to defense industry. We will see bringing European defense to another level of resilience, but there is still possibility for the US participating in it. Look at the news for the last 2 weeks in defense nerd circles. Rheinmetall and Lockheed Martin announced yesterday that they produce ammunition together for ATACMS and for Patriot systems in Europe, setting up a joint venture. MBDA and Raytheon are doing the same. General Dynamics European Land Systems has just announced last week a new product where they have their platform together with the European howitzer to produce a howitzer for the Spanish market. So there is very active US-European cooperation, and maybe it's even better to have common products, to have joint ventures, but it's for the resilience question. I think it's necessary to produce the ammunition we need for NATO Europe on the European continent, to have supply chains that we can support, because we see the Russian war against Ukraine, it's a long war, where industry, where supply chains, where technological base matters very much, and that's part of defense planning for Europe, to do that and not to rely on supply chains for a longer war that might include long transatlantic logistics. But it does not exclude the United States. I think it gives opportunities, but we need to strengthen the European industrial base, and as a German taxpayer, I'm all for it.
Tomi, very quickly.
Yeah,
just
very quickly.
voice.
You answer actually what you gave to Nico. You know, your question was at what point the European voters and audience gets bored, or of war in Ukraine. Polling shows very clearly that there's a big difference between the populations which feel that Russia is direct threat, and they do not. And those who, because I'm from Brussels, I have lived half of my life outside of Finland, but I play that hat now. Those countries will never get bored on the issue. It's you like asking, one gets cancer, and what point you get bored of it and say, I don't deal with this anymore. That's the situation. Those borderline countries, they feel like Ukraine. Ukraine will not stop because they don't have chance. The perception on those countries is that, Russia, for Putin, peace is bigger risk than war. He cannot stop, and so he will continue. So in those countries, for example, in my society, if you scratch a little bit the surface, men like me, they have plans where to teach the children, how to play that, and all of rest of that. So I think this commitment will not go away because it cannot go away.
We've sort of running out of time, and I've got this Slido app which I've managed to finally get working. And actually, I'm being asked the same question about 4 times. And it's to do, and I think it's actually one for Nico and Tomi, actually, because it's a question about what can we do in the short and medium term to carry on the process of integrating Ukraine into Western security structures. And if the formal membership of organizations like the EU and NATO are still in the distance, what can be done in the short term, particularly with defense industry? because there are some very interesting technologies that are being developed in Ukraine, particularly in drone technology. We hear a lot about how much Western weaponry is going into Ukraine and the sustainment logistics systems that are being put in place. But is there a scope for developing more bilateral organic links between EU, NATO and Ukrainian defense industry, which will be of benefit to everybody? Better equipment, more technologically advanced equipment for use in Ukraine, but also some very interesting lessons for military tactics and also for defense industry in Europe. Nico, is that something you want to take up?
The answer is yes. And I mean, just a few examples here. One is, I just read last week that France is very proud of delivering the full annual production of Caesar howitzers to Ukraine this year. And they will produce 58 of them. And I read it twice because they are producing 58 self-propelled howitzers in a year. How are we going to be impressed by that? Ukrainian producer KZVV, that did not produce any self-propelled 155 millimeter howitzers before the war, is producing 38 per month now. By the way, they cost 1/3 of a Caesar howitzer. So that's why countries such as Denmark decided, let's use our money with the Danish model to buy Ukrainian equipment with Ukrainian producers for the Ukrainian battlefield. It also will include all the spare parts, all the special tools and everything that is necessary, because we have this ridiculous system that because of intellectual property rights, you have to move the howitzer hundreds of kilometers by train somewhere to Lithuania or to Slovak Republic, wait for the original spare part and put it in and bring it back. I mean, that's not really a sustainable system to conduct a war. If you cooperate with Ukrainian industry, you can produce not only Pharma howitzers for a better price, you get very good personnel. By the way, all the defense producers in Europe, they have problems finding personnel, and because it's unionized personnel, you have them on your payroll until the end of history once you start growing. So why not using the qualified Ukrainians? By the way, it gives also an economic perspective to Ukraine if the defense industry is running. So that's perfectly logical if we talk about readiness, and if we do not perceive help for Ukraine as a kind of a booster for our own industrial policies. And another example is ammunition production. Ukraine is licensing and producing 155 millimeter shells to a large extent. And by the way, the Ukrainian domestic production and the development of the Ukrainian domestic production was producing more tangible results as the many meetings of the European Union about an ammunition initiative that could never really deliver results. So instead of delivering Gesamtkonzepte and writing papers about another papers, there is many concrete things that can be done by investing in Ukraine. And if the Europeans want to deliver a long-range standoff weapon, the ELSA project, because we do not have a European Tomahawk and we need this conventional deterrence capability. The country that is by far most advanced on this technology in Europe is Ukraine. And in the 90s, we had a chance to do a strategic joint venture to build a transport airplane together with Antonov. The decision was taken otherwise because of labor in Toulouse and in Hamburg, and we got the A400M. But let's use the chance. Let's do products together with Ukraine. They are very good at this, and it would be faster, and the result would be there for a lower price than with European cooperation projects which have a tendency of going forever, being overpriced, and not fulfilling on the readiness capabilities.
Well, I'd like to thank the panel. I think we started off with a sort of semi-pessimistic view. We were talking about divisions between America and Europe, between Europe and Ukraine, and within Europe itself. But what the panel, I think, has shown to us is actually there's a lot more unity than there is division. And we need to keep optimistic, working with those both in the United States and in Europe and in Ukraine who want to see us all together leading to a joint victory in the interests of the civilized world. Thank you very much to the panel for their comments, and thank you again, Reka, for this opportunity to present these views to a Hungarian audience.